breakdown. This is a live show with me, Max Ralph, and beside me, Johnny McGonigal. We didn't get a live show last week because of Christmas and the holiday and some travel to the Pinstripe Bowl and everything. And here today, we are outside of our normal time slot, Johnny, but it's 10 a.m. on Friday, January 2nd. And if you've heard that date a lot in the past few weeks, well, you probably have already figured out why this morning because the transfer portal officially opened and there are names flying left and right like crazy. Many of them involve Penn State, which obviously is not much of a surprise considering the coaching change and everything that's going on. But a lot of news that we have to dive into this morning, Johnny. Also, some stuff from the week. A couple of big retention pieces for Penn State. There's just a lot going on, and we're going to dive into all of it. Welcome to the show, Johnny. How we feeling?
I'm great, man. I'm great. The craziness never stops, right? We had that
No.
nutty Georgia Ole Miss game last night in the CFP quarterfinals lead right into midnight and right into officially January 2nd.
Oh
and,
my gosh, yeah.
Players were already announcing whether or not they were coming back or leaving, specifically with Penn State. Obviously, a lot of attrition, a lot of decisions with Matt Campbell coming in and James Franklin, and now a good bit of his staff going out. And we'll talk about that too in terms of some big assistant coaches on the move. To other programs in the SEC, more specifically. But yeah, it's been a hectic few days. A little inside baseball. Good for me, you, and Bob to have done a lot of pre-writes, on a bunch of different players that we thought had decisions to make, and just kind of in those stories being like, this guy will enter the transfer portal or will stay at Penn State. It was like one or the other. And we got a lot of clarity on a lot of those players over the last 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah, there are obviously still more to come and some big name ones still out there. And we're going to hit on those today. I think we have to start with quarterback because the dominoes have, for the most part, fallen there. We talked about it a lot last week. Bob and I talked about it a lot. It's just been kind of the discussion because as you went on in this season, Ethan Grunkemeyer looked really good, man. Like he played well. The game against Clemson in the Pinstripe Bowl was just excellent. 260 yards, career high, a couple of touchdowns in the fourth quarter in really poor conditions. Said, you know what? Yeah, like he could probably start at Penn State next year. Terry Smith certainly felt that way. He kind of campaigned for him. But there was always this elephant in the room of Matt Campbell, the Iowa State offensive staff, have their guy who's been in place as a starter for 3 years, and Rocco Becht. And it is the exact same offensive staff. He's got the same quarterbacks coach, offensive coordinator, offensive line coach, and wide receivers coach. The only thing it could be different is the running backs coach. So Rocco Becht could always come over, and he has entered the portal. And there are many reports out there, including ESPN's Pete Thamel, that he's going to visit Penn State. Look, my reading of the tea leaves on this situation, it's a done deal. Grunk is in the portal. Rocco Becht is in the portal. He's visiting Penn State. I believe Rocco Becht will be the starting quarterback at Penn State next year. Johnny, I think what this boils down to, I mean, you hate to lose a good quarterback like Ethan Grunkemeyer, no matter what the situation is. But I think, as you and I have kind of talked about, there's not necessarily a bad ending with either of these options. And now we at least know what's coming. We think so.
Yeah, and we'll start with Rocco Becht. Why Penn State, why Matt Campbell, why Taylor Mauser, the offensive coordinator, and the entire staff would want him. 3-year starter at Iowa State, ultra productive, especially in 2024. It helped having Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel, on the outside, throwing to those two NFL wide receivers now with the Houston Texans. But a quarterback who has played on the big stage, has played in the Big 12 title game, won 11 games for the Cyclones a couple years ago. This year was dealing with a labrum shoulder injury that he played through, had surgery after the regular season on that, and is expected to be good, for the 2026 season. He's a guy that clearly Matt Campbell and Taylor Mauser and crew have a lot of faith in, a lot of trust in. He has 1 year of eligibility. So this is a plug and play kind of rental. And again, it's not official, but it's all but official, right? With Grunkemeyer going to the portal, because we knew that we had a really good feeling that Ethan Grunkemeyer wasn't going to stay at Penn State if he wasn't going to be the starter and the future starter of this program. If he had stayed, he could have been the starter in 2027. But it's human nature, and it's totally understandable when you're coming off the hot streak that he's coming off of, leading this Penn State team to 4 straight wins, getting a taste of what it's like to be a starter at the power conference level, and a more than competent one at that, to try to cash in. And that's figuratively and literally, with the portal, but also not just monetarily or financially, but to secure yourself a spot as a unencumbered starter somewhere. And there is going to be a lot of suitors for him. There's going to be a lot of programs that are going to look at Ethan Grunkemeyer, look at what he's done over the last 2 months, over the last 7 games as a starter, see the progression, see the vision for the future for him. And so I don't blame him whatsoever for taking advantage of that opportunity. That's well within the right of any player, but especially quarterback. And we saw last year when Bo had to leave Penn State before the playoffs started to try to get his spot. And I know that the portal calendar has now shifted to avoid that from happening. But the overall point stands is that quarterback spots fill up quickly. There are a lot of quarterbacks who are already in the portal. So if Grunk was going to, leave, it was going to be as soon as the portal opened, and he needed to know basically what the deal was going to be. Did he have a spot as Penn State starter in 2026 or not? And I think him entering the portal tells you all you need to know there.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that's different this year is there is no spring portal window.
Right.
Quarterbacks still wanted to go in January so that they could get in and learn an offense and everything, but it still was possible for a guy like Grunk to feel it out with Becton here, but not anymore. Portal window is one and done, and this move is not surprising in either way. To talk a little bit more about Rocco Becht, he has the offensive infrastructure. We keep talking about how manageable the Penn State schedule is next season. You get this kind of stopgap guy who has been a star with the Cyclones. Like, he has been very good. You mentioned the 2024 season when he had both of those receivers that ended up being drafted. The numbers were gaudy. I mean, 3,500 yards, 25 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. This year, Iowa State did not have as prolific a passing attack, but the numbers were still pretty solid. I mean, 2,600 yards, 60% completion rate, 16 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. I mean, he's just a good veteran quarterback who can win you a big ball game. He's got a lot of experience, and you love the connection with the staff. What I'm more curious about is what comes after him, because there's an Alex Mansky, who's a 4-star prospect with Iowa State, who's in the portal. Does he come with? Of course, Peyton Falzone and Case Evans are committed out of high school right now. Jackson Smolik hasn't made his decision, but maybe the writing's on the wall for him too, because he's at that point in his career where, if you want to play, you better go find a spot to do it. And if Becht's coming in, it's probably not going to happen at Penn State. So I think I like the pickup of Becht. I would have liked if Penn State kept Ethan Grunkemeyer. I think both were good options. And I'm just curious to see where it goes now, because 2027, there's going to be another new guy, which is, I guess, kind of the norm in college football these days, with a lot of schools who are embracing the transfer portal and willing to go get a guy every year. But I like the move for Penn State. I think it's interesting. It sends a lot of ripple effects, but it was always kind of the biggest domino, and now we have some clarity on what's going on.
Yeah, obviously the ideal, perfect, utopic scenario would have been Ethan Grunkemeyer saying, you know what, I get it, bringing in your guy. I'm still sticking at Penn State. I'm going to stay. And look, obviously he's entering the portal, and this is a caveat for any player that enters the portal. They can come back. They can come back to their school. Not expecting that with Ethan Grunkemeyer. Not expecting it with a lot of these guys who, obviously have had a lot of time post James Franklin firing, and then ever since Matt Campbell was hired at the start of December, a lot of time to mull their decisions. If a Penn State player is entering the portal, 99.9% chance that they are not coming back to Penn State. It would have been great if you could get, both a veteran like Rocco in, again, the guy who has that institutional knowledge, who knows the playbook like the back of his hand, and against a very manageable schedule, you like that immediate floor to knowing kind of what you're, not necessarily knowing what your ceiling is on what he could do in the Big Ten or, with different talent around him, but knowing what your floor is with a quarterback like that, I think, goes a really long way, especially as you're trying to find your footing in a new conference as a first-year head coach. Like, that goes a very long way, that trust factor. I'm very intrigued to see where Ethan Grunkemeyer lands.
Oh yeah,
Really intrigued to see how he does at his next stop. Ohio native, Cincinnati is in the market for a quarterback. Brendan Sorsby entering the portal, and he's a guy who a lot of schools, a lot of big time schools are after. So maybe there's a Big 12 swap going on here. Rocco Becht coming
maybe.
over to Happy
Yeah.
Valley, and then Ethan Grunkemeyer going to Cincinnati. I think that would be a great fit. Obviously, a lot of other schools will be in the mix for him as well. So yeah, I was impressed with how Ethan played down the stretch, and I think there's going to be a lot of coaching staffs that are going to look at that tape, come away really impressed, and he's going to land himself in a really good situation.
Yeah, and wish him the best moving forward because
Yeah.
he was great to deal with as a member of the media as well. It definitely got better with us too throughout the time his time as a starter. Got more comfortable. You can see it both on and off the field. Great player. Think he's got a bright future ahead of him. Let's before we get to a little more portal talk, Johnny. A couple of things that probably didn't slip through the cracks, but maybe aren't front of mind because the transfer portal is so rampant right now. Penn State's got some coaching movement, and we know Deion Barnes left for South Carolina, which was a bit of a shock because Barnes, a Penn State letterman, there were rumors and kind of the expectation was that he was staying at Penn State. Clearly, South Carolina swooped in with a bag that Penn State wasn't willing to match, and he's off and into the SEC. And Penn State needed a defensive line coach. Well, they have reportedly found that guy, and I guess I can't really even say reportedly anymore because Ikaika Malloy, who was at UCLA, was the defensive coordinator there, has changed his profile picture on social media. He's all in on Penn State. It's an intriguing hire to be the defensive line coach, a guy who has serious experience as a play caller in the Big Ten. He knows the conference. He also knows who we are expecting and waiting for an official announcement on, but who will be Penn State's next defensive coordinator, Danton Lynn. They worked together with the Bruins in 2023. A lot of familiarity. Malloy has turned out a couple of first round picks in good NFL players and Vita Vea and Laiatu Latu over the past few years. Just an interesting guy who has tons of experience. And I don't know, the one thing that you miss a lot with Deion Barnes is the connection to Philadelphia and the recruiting that he was able to do here. But as far as a development at the position, I feel like Ikaika Malloy has got some chops there, and this is an intriguing hire.
Yeah, on the Dion front, just to stick there for a second, like it had to be a pretty big bag because I know that Penn State wanted to keep him, and
Mhm.
the expectation for a long time was that he was going to stay at Penn State. Now, let's think of where South Carolina is as a program. Shane Beamer, their head coach, was his seat was pretty warm, coming out of this last season. A lot of expectations around that team going into the year, then they fell well short of that. But Lenora Sellers is back, their quarterback. Dylan Stewart, their star edge rusher, who now Deion Barnes will get to work with and, kind of, give him a few tips before he goes off to the NFL. He's back. And so this is a South Carolina program that is very much in like, let's throw money at this thing now, try to, give Shane Beamer everything he needs to win in 2026. And if it doesn't work out, we might be looking for a new head coach anyway. So that's the kind of bag that these coaches and programs, head coaches, throw around to assistants when they're in not necessarily desperation mode, but kind of. So I don't blame Dion for leaving if he felt that that was the best for him for his career. And again, getting in the SEC, you want to be in the SEC or the Big Ten, so I get it. To then move on, like it's the Philly aspect of it is difficult, but there is something that, like, talking to a lot of high school coaches in the area here, Terry Smith has been a huge part of it as well. Obviously, he's a Pittsburgh guy and has a reputation for being a Pittsburgh guy, but it was really a tag team effort with Terry Smith and Deion Barnes in Philly recruiting and re-recruiting this area because it was a handful of years ago that they recommitted to recruiting the best players in the eastern part of the state, southeastern part of the state. And so retaining Terry, I think, will go a long way with continuing those relationships at some of the bigger programs in Philly. But losing Dion, obviously doesn't help that.
Yeah, I mean, especially when it's a guy who's a letterman. I mean,
Yeah,
he's been through it at Penn State. You know what you're getting. Deion Barnes did really good work, and he's still an up and comer. I mean, he's still so young for being a full time position coach. Was really well respected at Penn State. But they've moved on. They've got a guy in Ikaika Malloy who is like we said, tons of experience, interesting name. Been in the Big Ten, been on the West Coast. Just a different feel, and it's going to be a different defense. And they've got to work to make this roster, complete for 2026. Which brings us to another point on the defense, though, is Anthony Poindexter, which we were that was kind of the last big one on the coaching staff that we were waiting. Like, okay, this is a name you'd really love to keep around because everybody loves Anthony Poindexter. In the locker room, he's been great for him. Turned out a bunch of good safeties. Does he have a role here with Terry Smith still on staff in an undisclosed role, and Deion Broomfield following from Iowa State in a role that was just labeled secondary, though he did coach safeties with the Cyclones? Where does Anthony Poindexter fit in? Maybe he could have been the DC. Of course, you get Danton Lynn. Anthony Poindexter won't be the DC. Now he's going off to Tennessee to be the safeties coach. Reunite with Jim Knowles, by the way, in the SEC. And it's a loss for Penn State, but you don't blame Dex because you get to the point where there's just not a space for him. And it's a guy that I'm certain Penn State would have wanted to keep around, but it just didn't work out. And so now Anthony Poindexter is moving on.
Yeah, you mentioned Broomfield. You mentioned Terry Smith sticking around and his role being still kind of at least undefined to us, right. Publicly. And then Danton Lynn coming over as a defensive coordinator, a former defensive back himself. So there's like a lot of defensive backs, coaches with DB experience in the building. And Anthony Poindexter is looking around like, okay, well, where am I in the pecking order? Like, where am I in my career? Like, do I need to make another move? And you see this a lot, with coaches that ultimately they look at where they're at and it could be a comfortable spot, but it's like, okay, well, if I want to move up the ladder and become a defensive coordinator one day and become a head coach, one day, sometimes like I feel like Penn State to Tennessee in terms of just in a vacuum is a lateral move, but it's one that probably makes sense for Dex and to go and work with Jim Knowles, who, by the way, is going to be 61 years old next year. So maybe he's looking at that as a potential succession plan. I don't know. Like maybe that's how they view it. Maybe they don't. Maybe he'll be in Knoxville for 1 year or 2 years and just kind of reset and then attack it, become a defensive coordinator elsewhere. But yeah, I mean, Dex is one that definitely you would have loved to keep. But at the same time, Broomfield is a Campbell guy. Terry Smith was a massive retention. And then you have Danton Lynn coming in as a defensive coordinator and a coordinator, a coach that a lot of NFL experience, did a great job at UCLA, did a really good job at USC, turning that unit around, like relatively speaking. And so he's a guy that James Franklin had been after time and time again and wasn't able to bring in as a defensive coordinator. And now James Franklin is gone and he's coming to Happy Valley. So that's a little interesting. But, finally getting, Danton Lynn back in Happy Valley. And so I think overall you look at the defensive staff and it's a good staff, but you don't want to lose Dex. You don't want to lose a Deion. But that just happens. It's just the case. On the offensive side of the ball, I think you were okay with Danny O'Brien going, to Virginia Tech with Andy Kotelnicki heading out the door. You would have loved to keep Ty Howell as the tight ends coach, but him going to become an offensive coordinator in Blacksburg, understandably so. So as this roster turns over, the coaching staff was always going to turn over in some respects. So not surprised to see Dex go out the door, but obviously a loss.
Yeah, it's the churn of college football. It's how it goes. And when you make a head coaching change, these things happen. The Dex loss, however, does kind of, in my opinion, directly translate to one of the bigger transfer departures for Penn State on this Friday morning as we dive in a little more to the specific names and movement that's going on with the roster. Safety King Mack, who started pretty much all of this year, the guy who everybody knows pretty well, started at Penn State, transferred to Alabama, came back to Penn State, and like we said, played pretty well this year, in a defense that struggled at times with Jim Knowles' scheme. He was always kind of steady, at the very least, I would say. Was a steady player, and he also was a very, very strong advocate for the university and for this program. He continually, time and again, said how much he loved Penn State and how much he was glad he came back, and et cetera, et cetera. Anthony Poindexter goes to Tennessee. King Mack enters the transfer portal. I have to say it's one of the ones that surprises me the most because of the way that he spoke about Penn State. Like I'm thinking back to the Pinstripe Bowl, like pregame Zoom call we had with him, where he's saying, we didn't have good leadership on this team, blah 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 blah. I mean, the guy was very honest, and he very much indicated that he loved Penn State and everything that he was able to do here. So I think it's a surprise in that sense, but also we know how close he was with Anthony Poindexter. We know how close most of the defense and obviously the defensive backs were close with Anthony Poindexter. So it's not as surprising in that aspect. But among a lot of departures so far, I do think that this is one that it has pretty high impact.
Yeah, I mean, King Mac was sounding like a 2026 captain when he was on that Zoom call.
Right.
When he was on that Zoom call talking about the leadership, the lack thereof, really in the building, and he sounded like a guy who was going to step up into that role for this team, and not just as a player, not just as an impact playmaker, but as a guy who is going to lead this group, and he's not going to, and he's one of many though. The list is very long in terms of the guys who have entered the portal now that it's open, or have previously announced their intentions to enter the portal. He's one of a handful of defensive backs. We know that Elliott Washington, cornerback, is gone. AJ Harris, who has SEC experience, is gone. I wouldn't be surprised if a handful of these guys follow Dex to Tennessee, or ultimately follow James Franklin and co, to Blacksburg. But King Mac is one that you certainly would have loved to keep. Dejon Lane is one that you would love to keep, and you did keep. Darius Dixon, maybe the top defensive priority, maybe the top priority overall in the portal once Chaz Coleman entered, or announced his intentions to enter. Darius Dixon is staying, so we should just dive into this list, man, because it's lengthy on both sides.
It is. So let's start out. I mean, Johnny, where do you think? Which name do you think is the biggest one on either side of the debate? Staying, leaving?
For me, it's Darius Dixon staying. I felt that way, and I know you felt that way, and a lot of people, like anyone who watched this kid play this year, felt that way throughout the season, especially down the stretch. The game against Michigan State, ultimately what he did in the Pinstripe Bowl, could have had a couple of interceptions, but the fact that he was in those positions to make those plays. True freshman, top 100 recruit coming in. He was from California, from Mater Dei, a phenomenal program out there in California. And I'm sure USC, Oregon, the heavy hitters out there were just chomping at the bit to throw this guy a bag. And the fact that he stays, those kind of young, talented corners do not come around often. He's a cornerstone kind of piece for this defense. And I was really impressed with what he did as a true freshman. And he's going to continue, again, whatever capacity Terry Smith is in, he's going to learn from Terry Smith. He's also going to learn from Deion Broomfield. He's going to learn from Danton Lynn. Like, these are coaches that can mold a player like that. And this is a player that can be a real difference maker. And it's not just in 2026, but 2027 as well. So to have that longevity, to have that ceiling, like I think he is, again, once Chaz Coleman, because I think edge rusher and corner are the two of maybe, like, other than quarterback and maybe wide receiver, like the premier kind of positions that you want to value. NFL teams value them all the time in the first round of the NFL draft. And to be able to keep a player like that on your roster for now and in the future is massive.
Yep, I'm with you. I think Dixon probably would be my choice if I'm going to go for a second one just to be different. I think it's Tony Rojas. Obviously, coming off of an injury, you have to assume that he's going to be fully healthy when he comes back, but he's got plenty of time to do that. And man, when he was on the field this year, he was just so good. I understand that the competition was weak for the first 3 games, but he was great in the Oregon game. We know just how good of an athlete he is. I mean, the kid could have played Division I football as a running back. That's like not a lie. He had offers. We saw it when he made the pick 6 against SMU. Like the guy's got open field ability. Tony Rojas is an elite athlete. He really molded well into a linebacker. Knack for the big play, physical, strong. And if you get him back, like, I think he's a leader for this team. I think he is. And I think it's huge because linebacker and cornerback are key positions that you build a defense off of. This is linebacker U, right? We're talking about Penn State. you got a guy who's really good, who's got an NFL future. If I'm Penn State, I'm trying my darndest to keep Amari Campbell alongside him. But Tony Ross is a great building piece, and I think I wrote up when Matt Campbell was hired a list of 10 guys that I thought Penn State should really work to retain. And there are still others beyond those 10 that would really be great to keep. But of those 10, last night, I believe 5 of them had announced they were staying, and 3 were on their way out, and 2 were undecided. We got one of the others this morning. Ryan Barker is staying the kicker. So that's 6 of 10. And the last one, or excuse me, maybe Ryan Barker wasn't on that list. Ryan Barker is a big one. But Ivan Kamaju and Amari Campbell are 2 that were undecided as well. So either way, you're getting half of those guys. People were going to leave, but Matt Campbell and his staff have done an excellent job of keeping these guys around. And obviously that takes significant financial commitment. We know that this roster is going to be expensive this year, but they've targeted the guys that we felt as outsiders from the program were important to retain. And I think you got to give a round of applause to Matt Campbell for the way that he's gone about this so far.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked a lot about the defensive players in terms of Dixon, Rojas. Rojas is an interesting one because, obviously with the injury but he was a part of that leadership team really in the locker room. And he was probably the most vocal player in terms of keep Terry Smith or else. Yeah. That was kind of the vibe that he was giving. I mean, at one point, I think he did tweet and ultimately later deleted it that 90% of the roster would leave if Terry wasn't hired as the head coach. So just a interesting wrinkle dynamic there, but he's staying at Penn State. And so he's going to be a big part of this team moving forward. But looking at your list, Max, because I love that you hearkened back to that, putting that back out on Twitter after the fact. We talked a lot about those defensive guys. On offense, Kobe, the guys that you outlined, Ethan Grunkemeyer, okay, portal. We talked about him. But Kobe Howard, freshman wide receiver, Andrew Rappleyea, redshirt sophomore tight end, and Cooper Cousins, sophomore offensive lineman, all staying. And those guys are massive. Now, Luke Reynolds is another one who was probably on the fringe of that list.
Absolutely.
He's going out the door. We also know that there's, an all Big 12 tight ends from Iowa State that probably is going to be linking up in Happy Valley.
Yeah, already some predictions for Benjamin Brahmer to join Penn State, which, I mean, I'm sorry to throw you off track, but when you're thinking about a Taylor Mauser, a guy who really loves to run heavy personnel, 12 personnel sets, when you pair Brahmer, who is a 6'7" body, the guy is massive, with Andrew Rappleyea, those two guys, very talented. I'm excited to see how that goes next year if they get Brahmer in here. But continue.
I was just to add on that, because I was going to touch on it with Rapp. The way that he progressed this season, and especially down the stretch, and there was one play in the Pinstripe Bowl that ultimately didn't count. I think it was an illegal procedure. It was a pre-snap or whatever penalty it was on Penn State on offense. But there was this kind of smash fade, to the sideline that he caught. He just mossed his guy. And Taylor Mauser loves those plays, those kind of routes, those kind of those deep to intermediate kind of routes for the tight end specifically. And so I think Rapp could have a really big role in this offense. We talked about Kobe Howard. How much time have we spent on Kobe Howard over the last few months in terms of a talented youngster who really didn't get his shot, as earlier in the season, especially under James Franklin. But now he is going to get his chance. Obviously, he wouldn't stay at Penn State if he didn't feel like he is going to be a big piece of this offense moving forward. And so we've seen in flashes what he can do with the ball in his hands. And I think we're going to see more than just flashes in 2026. And Cooper Cousins, just a massive leader from the get-go. He was the leader in his recruiting class, ultimately ended up being a 5-star guy out of Erie McDowell. And when we talked to him even before last season, the first time we talked to the 2024 true freshman, he carried himself like he was 25 years old. He carried himself like he was a vet. And I think he's going to play like one. And he wasn't a nail-on starter this year like I thought he was going to be. But obviously got a good bit of run. And I thought he played well in the Pinstripe Bowl. And I think he's going to play well in this offensive line that is under repair. You look at this offensive line and how many pieces they're losing. Anthony Donko coming back as well, which is big. But Cooper Cousins is a centerpiece, literally in the center, as the center or the left or right, left or right guard. But a centerpiece and building block for this offense and offensive line, moving into 2026 and even 2027.
Yeah. Johnny, we're running out of time here on the live edition of the Blue White Breakdown, so I want to make sure we move forward to some of the guys who are departing.
Yeah.
Like we said, round of applause to Matt Campbell and his staff. A great group of retention so far. Still some other names out there that you need to get, but I think when you take into account the entire situation, the way college football is these days, being able to retain that many guys is huge. Guys who are on their way out, we already knew about Chaz Coleman. We already hit on Luke Reynolds, Ethan Grunkemeyer, AJ Harris, Elliott Washington on this show today, as well as King Mack, who is a big one. Johnny, is there another name out there that really surprised you, intrigued you, a loss that you think will really affect Penn State? I mean, those are the big ones so far, I would say. You can even highlight one of those if you want to, but your take on the departures thus far.
Yeah, just a few more to add. Guys I'm not surprised by, like Caden Saunders. He was a big time recruit when he came in. It just never happened for him. Injuries set him back. First of all, coming in, I think it took him a little bit, to get adjusted to the college game and where you need to be to play at this level. And then just injuries from there on out, kind of doomed his Penn State career, but, interested to see if he's able to revive it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Some guys who, had big roles this year that I thought that would continue to have big roles moving forward. Xavier Gilliam at defensive tackle is a big one. Jalen Harvey at defensive end would have been, a big part of this defense. I mean, Zariah Fisher, again, I don't know how he has another year of eligibility, but he does, or at least he's going for it, right? He's going for another year. So those are some guys on defense. Javen Williams, that's one where, he's a YO missing guy, former 5-star, but we know the background. At YO, they run such a run-heavy offense that it took him a long time to get comfortable in pass protection. And I remember talking to him in August, and he could have left via the portal last offseason because it's really uncommon that a 5-star like him, and I know offensive line is different than, say, a quarterback, a wide receiver, running back, whatever, but it's still uncommon that 5-stars, bide their time that long at a university, especially in the portal era. So now he's finally entering the portal. Interested to see where he ends up, whether he stays local or if he ends up following Phil Trautwein to Florida, if he believes in the Trautwein vision. So just a handful of names, but there's a lot of them, but a lot of attrition, a lot of guys that you're not surprised by. Like,
right.
It wouldn't stun me if Gilliam and Harvey, two guys from the DMV area, end up at South Carolina with Deion Barnes. Wouldn't be surprised, at all, especially once Deion leaves. It's like, okay, I'll just follow my guy to the SEC. So don't be shocked if that happens.
Yeah, I'm with you. You mentioned Javen Williams and Caden Saunders. Javen, it just didn't quite work out for Caden. I keep going back to Caden Saunders being like one of the biggest what ifs of James Franklin's tenure at Penn State, because he was a legitimate recruit out of high school. The speed, the talent was there, and God knows Penn State could have used a dominant wide receiver on this run over the past couple of years. Wish the best for him. Good kid when we got the chance to talk to him. And he has another opportunity to go make it work somewhere if he can stay healthy. I'm with you. The defensive line, no surprise at all. Luke Reynolds is a big one. Look, he struggled with some drops at times this year, but the profile is there. Like, it's there. He is a uber athletic tight end who is still getting there blocking wise, but if he can clean up the drops, which there's no reason to believe he can't, he can really be a legitimate threat in the receiving game. And there are some reports out there that he entered the portal with a do not contact tag, which I think you can probably count on him ending up in Blacksburg with James Franklin. A big loss. I think that's the biggest one for me, because Chaz Coleman the writing was kind of on the wall there with that one. I mean, he was, chopping it up with the Ohio State group right after the game in Columbus. All the predictions, all the signs point to him being a Buckeye next year. And
Buckeye
I'll also
coded.
say,
yeah,
right, Buckeye coded. I'll also say, like, Chaz Coleman has a high ceiling, as high a ceiling as almost any player on Penn State's roster from this past season. But there are steps that he has to take to get there. I mean, the physicality's got to change. I think it's a huge loss for Penn State, but if I'm being honest, when I see him ranked at the top of these portal lists, like as a top 10, it's in some cases the number one player in the portal. I don't know if I'm all the way bought into that hype train yet. I think the ceiling is that high. I don't know that the product right now is that high, but he's certainly a big one as well.
Yeah, totally. I think a part of that equation of why he's held in such high regard, and again, you've seen the flashes, but two, because defensive end is such a valuable position, edge
Mhm.
rusher, pass rusher is such a valuable position, and so I get it. Looking down the line at some other guys too, Alex Birchmeyer, came here as an offensive lineman in his recruiting class as one of the highest ranked linemen, but not surprised given how it didn't really work out for him here. Virginia guy, Virginia Tech, Florida with Phil Troutwine. Again, one to look for there. But then you look at like some of the younger players, Daniel Jennings, who came in as an early enrollee, reclassification. You look at like Braz Thomas. You look at Anthony Specca, linebacker, out of Central Catholic in Pittsburgh. Maybe he ends up at Pitt. Like there's a lot of these guys. TJ Shanahan is one that I'm just kind of going down the list here because there are so many names, and I want to make sure that
Right,
we hit
right.
as many as we can. But TJ Shanahan is one that probably could have started on the interior of this
Mhm,
offensive line next season.
mhm.
So the fact that he goes from A&M to Penn State for 1 year and then back in the portal is noteworthy. Again, maybe he ends up back in the SEC. So
Yeah.
just something to keep in mind as Dion goes to South Carolina, Troutline goes to Florida. You've got a cadre of former Penn State assistants in Blacksburg. Those are some landing spots for some of these guys, but ultimately to be able to keep Darius Dixon, Rap, Kobe Howard, Tony Rojas, if you're able to keep Amari Campbell,
Mhm.
which I'm intrigued to see, if they're able to keep him because, I'm sure that they had to invest quite a bit in Tony Rojas to keep him in Happy Valley. Do you invest doubly into linebacker, from just an NIL allocation standpoint? Intrigued to see what they ultimately do there.
Yeah, I'm with you on all points. Amari Campbell's a big one, and realistically, when you look at the keeps that you're like, okay, they got to get this guy and keep him in place. They've pretty much we've seen what's happening with almost all of them, except for an Amari Campbell and an Yvonne Kamaju. You can look on the offensive side, Quentin Martin after that 100-yard performance. I think the signs right now are pointing to him coming back, which could be big. We don't really know if that 100-yard performance is who he is long term, but he's a talented kid who I'd love to see more from. Those are pretty much all the big ones. I mean, there's gonna be more movement on the edges of this roster. Keep in mind too, we hardly talked about anyone who could come over from Iowa State or other names in the portal. You will hear a lot more from us about that the next time you see us. But we do have to wrap this thing up here today. We're hitting our time for this edition of the Blue White Breakdown. But yeah, we wanted to keep it mostly Penn State focused today. The guys who are leaving, staying, a lot of discussion about the quarterback situation, which we finally have some clarity on here. And there's just so much going on. It's the transfer portal day. It's finally open. It should be a national holiday moving forward, honestly. But
Yeah.
Johnny, let's send this thing out. Penn State doing good work. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. Subscribe to PennLive.com. Subscribe to the show on YouTube or wherever you're listening, and make sure you stay tuned because a lot more is going to come.